Hey everyone, this is Cabane. This will be the last of 3 videos on biblical hermeneutics through the lens of an exegesis of a little detail in the Gospel of Mark. But before getting into the main portion of this discussion, if you find these videos edifying, please consider becoming a patron. Even a monthly contribution of $5 or less is instrumental in facilitating the continued production of quality content and engagement with the audience. The first two tiers provide access to select premium content, though my preference is really to keep most content available for a general audience. And the third tier, on top of the content made available in the first two, guarantees at least 1 hour per month of discussion over Zoom or equivalent, which you can take advantage of every month if that's what you would like to do. So if you want to support this channel and you want to ensure that most of the content continues to be available to a general audience, and that is my intention, for sure I'm not about to take it off, but that is supported by the patronage, then please do consider becoming a patron at any of the tiers. But only, please, if you're in a financially sound position. Equivalent YouTube memberships are also available, though the price is somewhat higher because YouTube takes a higher proportion monthly. So the other note about this is that I think if I get about 15 to 20 more patrons, I'll be able to remove ads entirely for everybody. I know that they're frustrating for those who do get ads. I would provide ad-free versions for patrons, but unfortunately there's just no way to do that at present, though I think there will be soon. But my hope is that I'll be able to remove them all entirely within the next few months. So if that's something that you'd like to see, please consider becoming a patron. But thank you everyone who's already contributed, and thank you for everyone who is a member of this audience. I really do appreciate your participation here. So let's get into the main discussion. So when you recognize the relationship of the spring of the water of life, or the well, to the inclusion of Gentiles, or the extension of divine life through God's children into more and more nations, and when you recognize that this is described as being realized in its most glorious way in the Messianic age, specifically from the divine presence that flows through the water that wells up in the center of the temple, that is the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary. It flows out, gives life to the fish. And when you realize that that image is related to Sodom and Gomorrah, it's related to the inversion of the judgment of the 5 cities of the plain, implicitly through the reference to the Dead Sea in Ezekiel 47, explicitly through Isaiah 19, which refers to 4 out of 5 cities being redeemed and only one being called the city of destruction. The connection, which at first seemed to make very little sense, begins to make a great deal of sense. The tomb of Christ is the Holy of Holies. The Gospel of John is quite straightforward on that. I think it actually has many theological implications for the Paschal feasts that we have in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's a topic perhaps for another video, perhaps not for a video at all. I think I've talked about it a bit in my live streams, but if the tomb of Christ is the Holy of Holies, and the Holy of Holies is the place from which the spring of the water of life wells up and flows out to give life to the nations, well, then the correspondence between the tomb of Christ in Mark 16 and the well, which has a round stone over it, which is rolled away to give drink to sheep in Genesis 29, well, that actually is beginning to come into quite sharp focus. We begin to see that Gentiles are included in this symbolic correspondence, and when you recognize that connection, well, then you realize that a lot of Jesus's language makes sense in that light as well. For example, in John chapter 10, Jesus says, "There are other sheep who are not of this fold, them also I must bring, so that they may be one fold and one shepherd." Jesus's ministry to the Gentiles is something of a disputed point. Some people have taken Jesus's words to mean that he has no ministry to the Gentiles, which is contrary to the apparent sense of much of his actual work in the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels. It mentions his miracles done for a Roman in the Gospel of John. He is mentioned as being revered by Greeks at the festival prior to his crucifixion. But it looks like in the Gospel of Matthew, I think it's the most straightforward on the geography of this, it looks like Jesus, after he undergoes a tough series of episodes with Israel's leadership, he has the there's the narrative of the Canaanite woman who says that she is content with crumbs from the table of the master, and then after that, Jesus goes and he feeds the 4,000 with not just crumbs, but with bread. Now, the location of the 4,000, well, this is a Gentile location. This makes additional sense given that Jesus calls attention to the fact that seven barrels are left from, or baskets, I think, are left from the feeding of the 4,000, in contrast to and in relation to the 12 which are left from the feeding of the 5,000. Now, both of them are feedings of bread and fish. We've noted before how fish correspond to Gentiles. Bread, they correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel. There are 12 loaves of face bread on the a table of face bread, appropriately named in the tabernacle and the temple. So the feeding of bread and fish to both Jew and Gentile signifies the feeding of Jew and Gentile to each other. That is, they are knit together in one body. If you are what you eat the same thing, you become each other, you dwell in each other, which is why marriages are associated with feasts. One flesh, so you're going to eat one flesh. And it signifies the reality that it is not just the individuals being bound together, but their respective families as well. They are joined together as agents and representatives of those larger organisms. All of this is coming into play when we're dealing with the theme of the Gentiles in the Gospels and through the Gospels in the Torah and the Prophets. We see in Genesis chapter 48 that it is prophesied of Ephraim. Ephraim is the elder. I shouldn't say elder. He is the heir of Joseph. Jacob actually blesses Joseph's children in the reverse order of their birth. He crosses over his arms in doing so. But Ephraim is the heir of Joseph, and thus the northern kingdom, which is associated with Joseph as intimately as the southern kingdom is associated with Judah, the northern kingdom, instead of being personally called Joseph, when the prophets address that nation, they address it by the name Ephraim, typically. And we are told that Ephraim will become a multitude of nations. We're told earlier Abraham will be a father of many nations. And this association between Ephraim and the Gentiles is something which is developed throughout the Pentateuch and the prophets. It's a very interesting thread. I haven't actually worked out its exact inner logic yet, but there's a great deal there. It's certainly in the New Testament, and it is certainly in the prophets. The way that it works is something I'm still kind of working through, but there's no question that it's there. For example, you can find, if you're looking for a New Testament example, when Paul quotes the passage from Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people. Those who are not beloved, I will call beloved. So that in the very place it was said to them, not my people, there it will be said, sons of the living God. That is a reference to the regathering and inclusion of the northern kingdom. A friend of mine pointed out to me that in Jeremiah chapter 3, which describes the gathering of all nations into the city of God, where God's glory is directly present. They don't need the Ark of the Covenant anymore. It's just God's glory, which is immediately present. My friend pointed out to me that it is given in the context of the relationship between the two houses of Israel. And we are told that it is the northern kingdom which is the first to be gathered, and that they are the instrument for the final gathering of the Judahites. This twofold model is something which is developed, I would argue, in Romans 9 to 11, where the remnant of Israel, that is the Judahites, the Jews, Israel according to the flesh in the first century, they are the means by which the Gentiles hear the gospel. Those Gentiles, who are the many nations, corresponding to Ephraim, which is why the Gentiles are called the 10 men in Zechariah, who take hold of the tassel, the wing of the Judahite, because God is present with him. Paul quotes that or echoes that in 1 Corinthians chapter, I think it's chapter 14. Well, those 10 men correspond to the 10 tribes, even as they signify the Gentile world. And as the Gentiles are gathered in and leavened and sanctified, then ultimately we are told that it provokes the flesh of Jesus, that is the Judahites, the Jews, to jealousy, so that all are reunified and reconciled, and the whole family is brought to peace in the Messianic King. That is a programmatic narrative, which is I've written stuff on that in Isaiah, but what I hadn't noticed is that it is definitely there in Jeremiah chapter 3 as well. When we look at it through the lens of the northern and the southern kingdoms, that's a very important correspondence, which is underappreciated relative to its significance in the narrative arc and symbolism of the Bible. Mention it here because in the Gospel of John, when Jesus mentions a sheepfold which is twofold, and there being other sheep, he is undoubtedly making reference to this kind of language which is used of the two houses of Israel in the prophet Ezekiel. Now, in the Gospel of John, Jesus already has made extensive reference to Ezekiel. In John chapter 3, for example, talking about the rebirth of water and the Spirit, there's no question that if you go back to Ezekiel chapter 36 and following, that is where you're going to find much of this language and many of these themes. This is the whole idea of rebirth. It's rooted and grounded in the history of the Exodus, and there's the new Exodus, which is prophetically filled in Jesus, and it's realized in us in baptism, and that's what's going on in the story of John chapter 3, which is why, of course, after John 3, the first thing that, after the discussion with Nicodemus, the first thing we hear is about the various ministries of baptism that Jesus and John the Baptist had. It's amazing to me, not only how many people miss that, but how long in thinking about whether this was a reference to baptism or not. It's amazing to me how long I didn't actually realize that the most obvious clue is that John explicitly narrates baptism immediately after the discussion of rebirth of water and the Spirit. In any case, the language of the sheepfold, which is twofold, with the northern and the southern kingdoms, we know in light of the whole Bible, both Old and New Testaments, that this is about the unity of Israel and the nations, because of the reasons that I've just gone into. I've talked about this in other videos. This is probably one of the central themes of the Bible, so I'm not going to exhaust it or get anywhere near exhausting it in one video, no matter how long-winded the video is. But this is one of the upshots of the identification that we've made in Mark 16 and Genesis chapter 29. Now we can identify the sheep that are there in Genesis chapter 29. Now we know the relationship of the Gentiles to the sheep, and that leads us to ask additional questions of the text, which in turn provide additional evidence for things that we were already inclined to see, and they help us ask new questions and form new interpretive hypotheses. I would be inclined to call something with one piece of exegetical evidence, one connection, a interpretive hypothesis, and then you start thinking through the rest of the Bible, and if there are other things which glom onto that and they thread through very neatly, then it looks like it's actually there. If it's very difficult, if you have to force things, then maybe it's time to keep working. Now that is it is less of a science. In fact, science itself is less of a science, of a kind of a boring, dry, systematic method, separated from intuition and all that lovely stuff. But people like to say interpretation is more of an art than a science. Well, science is more of an art than a science. But I think you understand what I'm saying here, that this is a habit, a pattern of exegesis that really cannot be taught by a set of rules. It's really something that practice is going to make perfect. It is something that you got to learn gradually over time. You just get into the rhythm of it, just as you would get into the rhythm of anything. It's a particular way of thinking, a habit of threading particular ideas together in a specific way. And the interesting thing is that as you thread these biblical ideas together in this way, you will realize that as you walk through the world, the same God who wrote the Bible also wrote the stuff of the world, and the world is remarkably subject to interpretation by the same pattern, and it can be remarkably productive, just in intuiting the way things may or ought to be. Giving an example would get into whole other issues, which I don't really want to get into at the moment. But the one thing I am willing to say in this video is that in certain of the sciences, the kind of theoretical development of the discipline has stalled. I mean, if you look at physics over the past several decades, as far as the kind of empirical dialogue that data is meant to have with theory, it's effectively not happening. We have the standard model, which has been largely confirmed, and yet the major questions which were being asked a generation and a half ago are still the major questions that are being asked today. It's kind of ossified. I think part of the job of deossifying stuff like this is to learn to ask different questions in new, different ways. As Lee Smolin has pointed out in his book, The Trouble with Physics, one of my favorite books of all time. It's really an extraordinary book. Just it's interesting as to the science itself. It's very interesting as to the method. It's very insightful as to the nature of the scientific enterprise. And Smolin, I'm very sympathetic with because he is a fan of Paul Feyerabend, against method, and was actually a personal friend of his, and actually knows that there are philosophers of science whose name is not Karl Popper. No disrespect to Karl Popper, but that's totally off topic. I may well actually, split this video in two when I, edit it. But interpretation is something that is developed over time, not by the memorization of rules, but really by continuing practice, by being willing, in a sense, in a specific way to experiment, by being willing to say, well, I think this may connect to this, even if you aren't completely sure. Now, there's a boundary, which is the tradition, but the tradition is our profession of the one God in Trinity. In other words, not specific exegetical information. This text must mean this, not usually at least. But there are many different interpretations of text which could potentially, or which do harmonize with our teaching about who God is and what God has done, but which may or may not be the actual way in which God has expressed himself in Scripture. I hope I'm being clear about what exactly I mean there. And the most important thing, I think, in developing that pattern, that skill, is total Bible saturation. You really do have to know the Bible, and not just the bits that most people know. I think I know the Bible in an above average way, but there's so much in there. There's so much in there that I am really not sufficiently familiar with. And that's both frustrating and exciting. I mean, there's a great deal more that I know I haven't really dug into, and that I know is not just filmed with insights about the passage itself, but, for example, say Leviticus 26. I couldn't tell you what was in Leviticus 26. I know that in Leviticus 20, actually, I think it's the blessings and curses. I think it's the blessings and curses of the covenant, but I'm not sure. If I got that right, that I promise you I did not pre-plan that in some kind of corny, narcissistic way. But I know that in the text whose content I'm not particularly acquainted with, that when I do get acquainted with it, there's going to be lots and lots of stuff that I learn, not only about those texts, but about texts that I'm already acquainted with. I know that I'll learn new things about John, about Matthew, about Genesis, about Isaiah, so on and so forth. The Bible, every passage, every verse, to draw an image, I think, is from Irenaeus, is both a door, and this isn't the exact image, this is but a riff on what he says, it's both a door and a key. But the thing is, the key to one door is in a very different and far dislocated verse than the door itself. And the key that we find in the verse in question opens a door far dislocated from the verse in which you find the key. Now, in time, one begins to see the network of correspondences, and one begins to see the way that the reason that the Bible was produced this way. So there's a great deal of just, honestly, just it's fun in the Bible. I think the Bible is more fun than it's given credit for, and I don't think it's just I'm a idiosyncratic person. Maybe I am, but I think God has written the Bible in such a way that his people, and by his people I mean the human creature who he himself invented and wired. I think human beings in general, even those who wouldn't think of themselves as academic or theologically inclined or even religiously inclined. I think when one begins to get into the Bible, one begins to just be attracted to it and drawn to continuing to study it. Anyway, I think there are a couple other things I might want to say about this. I was going to talk a little bit more about the theme of water in the Joseph story, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this as probably one video, and maybe I'll split it into two, but I'm going to save the water for another video. And what I will say is kind of add a postscript on a possible implication for the connection of Genesis 29 with Mark 16. So the other Gospels, if my checking was correct, because I did check to see if large stone was used in the other Gospels, and the Greek words large stone, and roll away is the same in the LXX of Genesis 29 and in the Greek of Mark 16. One of the questions which this may well help illumine is the way that Mark 16 is written. So obviously, the conventional view within the Academy is that Mark 16:9-20 is a later edition, that the original manuscript of the Gospel of Mark either ended in Mark 16:8 or the original ending of Mark is lost because the way that scrolls are designed, they tend to break at the beginning and end. And I've recently realized that, that particular fact could just as easily be applied to the breaking off of the ending of Mark that we have in the Alexandrian manuscript tradition. So that may the explanation for why there are certain anomalies in the Alexandrian tradition and not in other manuscript families may well be as simple as that. An early scroll broke at the end, and that's what happened. But as you read Mark 16, 1-20, when you read it all as an integrated narrative, and I think the manuscript evidence is very, very strong in favor of 16:9-20, not to mention the fact that despite our earliest manuscripts being Alexandrian manuscripts, they seem to reflect awareness of the existence of this text. There are spaces in the manuscript indicating that the scribe was aware that this resurrection narrative was a reality, which already mitigates the value of Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus as witnesses to the non-existence of the ending of Mark. But also, the significance and importance of the relative date of a manuscript is its witness to the state of the New Testament text at a given time. The fact that it is the earliest physical manuscript we have is interesting, but as a matter of textual criticism, it is not ultimately the most significant point, because we know that Mark 16:9-20 is quoted widely in patristic writers prior to Sinaiticus and Vaticanus across a wide range of areas. So that establishes that the text existed very early. But if you read it internally, some of the arguments against Mark 16:9-20 being authentic are just specious. The idea that this has unique non-Markan terminology, well, if you look at Nicholas Lund's book, he shows how specious that is in terms of what we would expect, given the fact that this is that almost none of the pericope in Mark actually narrate a resurrection, and some of this language, actually a lot of this language, would only be appropriate in the narrative of a resurrection. And when you take into account the number of unique words that you would expect in just any pericope in general, it really isn't anything extraordinary, the number of one-time or two-time words that you find in Mark 16:9-20. I think probably the most persuasive internal argument against its authenticity is the way the narrative frame appears to shift. Nevertheless, one would expect, if this were the work of a forger, that he might do a little bit of a better job tying Mark 16:9-20 into the pre-existing and established narrative frame. For example, if one is going to use this kind of methodology about what one would expect a scribe to do with the manuscript, a methodology about which I've expressed my skepticism, but is common in text criticism. So if we're going to use it for the sake of argument, if we have someone who has Mark 16:8 in front of him, he's not happy with the way that it ends, and he wants to produce an ending which fills out the narrative, well, why doesn't he narrate Galilee appearances? He knows that Galilee has been the area which has been identified. It seems to reflect a bit of chutzpah to instead ignore the Galilee appearance and instead focus entirely on Jerusalem. It seems to me, actually, that it's the kind of literary chutzpah which makes sense better in terms of the pen of the actual author of the text, where he knows what he's doing and he knows the intentionality with which he's crafting his story, and he is not trying to produce a text which is supposed to be anything other than what it really actually is. Now, is this the strongest argument in the bag? No, but part of its purpose is to undermine the whole credibility of this methodological what would our scribe do in X situation, and using that to adjudicate between manuscript evidence and such. So the manuscript evidence is quite straightforward, I think. I've made that argument. James Snap has made it far more cogently and robustly than I have. Nicholas Lunn, in his book on the long ending of Mark, has made it more cogently and robustly from a manuscript perspective than I have. So what the narrative as we have it, we want to explain a couple things. First, why does Mark decide to record the word of the angel with reference to Galilee if he has no intention of referring to any appearances besides the ones that took place in Jerusalem? Well, this I don't think is all that difficult of a question to answer. I think the purpose here is to give a link with the beginning of Mark's gospel, which has a special place for Galilee. And at the beginning of Mark's gospel, we have the word that after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee. He proclaimed the gospel of God, and this is where we have his first proclamation. The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. And then he says, follow me, I will make you fishers of men. And so the explicit reference to Galilee ties the end of the gospel in with the beginning of the gospel, so as to establish Jesus's calling as that which is being fulfilled in the narrative which follows. I think Mark also uses this saying because, number one, he is conservative. He does not want to invent sayings in anyone's mouth. And what he wants to do is to further develop the theme and complete the theme of the way of the Lord and those who go before the apostles and those who follow the proclamation of the gospel of the way of the Lord, which is the major theme of the book of Isaiah, that he opened his gospel with. It's the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. And it is the way of the Lord which is unveiled in the messianic work. And it is the way of the Lord in which anyone at all finds what we call in Christian theology salvation, because the way of the Lord is the way of the Lord. It is God's way of being. And I mean, this is a major biblical theme. God says to Abraham, walk before me, be perfect. There's the way of the garden, it was the way into the Garden of Eden. Moses' face becomes glorious when God walks in front of him and Moses is behind him. He sees his back but not his face. And actually, the word for discussion on the subtle matters of the Torah is halakha. And that comes from halak, meaning walk. So the idea of abiding by and in the way of the Lord, becoming attuned to his pattern of being, and thus attaining to the wisdom which is the inner essence of the Torah and the inner essence of Christ himself, that's the major biblical theme that I think John wants to develop with reference to Jesus. So that's how the Gospel of Mark begins, and Mark does not want to, he's not willing to invent a saying, and the saying that he has, which allows him to complete that theme, is the saying that comes from the voice of the angel. Go to tell his disciples, Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. Jesus precedes the apostles, goes before them, they follow him, and then they act as the heralds of the king who has come to Zion. Now in Isaiah, it is the God of Israel who goes before his redeemed people. This is, of course, the glory cloud. And who is it that is crowned in Isaiah 40 to 55? Well, it is the God of Israel. Isaiah 52:7 speaks of from eye to eye, they see God returning to Zion. And what is it that happens on Zion? We have the coronation as king. It is thus in that next chapter that we have the suffering servant who is afflicted and who is sent away from the land of the living despite having done no wrong. He prolongs his days. He sees his seed becoming married to Jerusalem, so that Jerusalem is no longer barren but produces a multitude of children for Abraham. That's the major theme in Isaiah, and Mark is developing that with Jesus as the visible revelation of Israel's God, something which Isaiah himself has developed, because if you pay attention very closely to the text, you will realize that Isaiah 7, about Emmanuel, is part of a narrative which is very deliberately and specifically echoed with reference to the narrative arc of the suffering servant in Isaiah 40 to 55. It's not something I made up. This is something which is there in the text, and it is something which has to be dealt with by anybody who believes either that Jesus has nothing to do with the actual narrative arc of the Hebrew Bible, that he's not Israel's Messiah, in other words, and it must be dealt with by those who believe that these are just made-up, fictitious texts which are fragmented and thrown together haphazardly without any overarching order or design. So that, I think, is an aspect of the reason that Mark chooses to refer to this Galilee appearance. Another interesting point that I would want to make in this vein is that Mark 1:9 we hear about, or Mark 1, it's Mark 1, I believe it's 14 and following, where Jesus proclaims the gospel of God, time is fulfilled, and so forth. Jesus' proclamation of the gospel at the beginning of Mark, if you follow my argument that this is one of the things which is being echoed by the Galilee reference in 16:7, this is a subtle, if not decisive, but it is something to consider. It is a point in favor of the unity of 16:9 to 20 with the preceding passages and with the whole gospel in turn. Because the passage that I suggested was being wrapped up and tied together with the Galilee reference was Mark 14. Jesus comes into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. He does so in the immediate context of John's being sent into prison, and John is, of course, John the Baptist. He is the one who is baptizing a baptism of repentance. And what is it that we are told at the end of Mark, in Jesus' words? Jesus says to his apostles, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation." And then he says, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Now here we have all of the themes in turn which have been, which were developed at the beginning of Mark. We have proclaim the gospel. Proclaim and gospel are both there. But also, as Jesus went into Galilee at the beginning, now at the end of Mark, Jesus says, you go into all the world. As I was in Galilee, you go to the world. Moreover, believe the gospel, repent and believe the gospel is there at the beginning of Mark's narrative, in Jesus' words. And here at the end of Mark, we have the statement, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, which is an important point because Mark begins with a narrative of John's ministry, which is a baptism of repentance. Jesus then says that these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. Well, what is it that happens there? At the beginning of Mark, we have, among his first miraculous acts, exorcisms. In fact, I think that is Jesus's first mighty act. And we have the statement that if you lay your hands on anyone, they will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. That's what Jesus says. Well, at the beginning of Mark, it is not only that Jesus does exorcisms and heals the sick, but we are specifically told that Jesus heals the sick with reference to the hand. It says in Mark 1:31 that Jesus came and took her, that is Peter's mother-in-law, by the hand, lifted her up, the fever left her, she began to serve them. And then in Mark 1:40 and following, specifically 1:41, Jesus stretches out his hand and causes the leper to be clean. So, it seems to me there are things here which do not immediately seem to me to have a corresponding referent here, but it is not a repetition. It is something which corresponds, and I think we have a very substantial number of correspondences here between the beginning and end of Mark, and actually there are quite a few more than I realized were present that when I began this miniature discussion. So, in relation to Genesis 29, the reason that I began the discussion about the end of Mark's gospel is because I think the way that Mark's narrative structure works in chapter 16 seems to follow the pattern of Genesis 29 fairly closely. In Mark 16, we have a very vivid narrative which narrates something which takes place over a very short period of time, narratively speaking, as in it takes place over only a few hours rather than months or years or whatever. In Mark 16, we have the description of what happens on one Sunday morning. We have these women, they go to the tomb. It's on the first of the week. It's very early. The sun risen. They're asking who's going to roll away the stone. They saw the stone was already rolled back, and then the phrase which got us started with all this, it was very large. They see the young man. This is a description that is sometimes used for an angel. All of this happens, and then he tells them to go tell the disciples of Peter he's going to Galilee. And then it says they went out, they fled from the tomb, trembling in astonishment, seized them, and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so some people say, well, here this is a contradiction with the other gospels because they said nothing then. Now, the very fact that this is being written, okay, Mark we know the reader does not have to be told that, yes, eventually they said something to someone. Okay? This is one of those things where the text is pretty straightforward, but people have trouble, reading it for what it actually says. What it's saying is that they come to the tomb, they're really astonished, and they rush away. And as they're rushing, remember, this is early in the morning, this is dawn, people they're getting out, this is after the Sabbath, okay? So now they're going to go out from their homes, they're going to go about their business. Now, as they're going about their business, this is Jerusalem, this is a major city, this is the central city in Judea. There are all these people who are futzing around. And as they're futzing around, the women are rushing down the street. And they're rushing down the street. And this has been a pretty eventful Passover. Okay, so Passover means there's going to be lots of people there. You're going to have guests. You're going to have family. You're going to have your crazy uncle. You're going to have your annoying cousins. Everyone's there for Passover. Annoying time of year. It's been a really crazy Passover. This major prophet got there the week before. People were expecting the Messianic kingdom. He was executed. His disciples have been scattered. People know, roughly speaking, who has been said to have been around. So you see these women, who at least some people in the city know have been associated with Jesus, who was just executed. And the charge on which he was executed on the Roman side was treason, though Pilate knew it was a trumped-up charge. But that's the official charge, and, you gotta play out your scenario. So, yes, it looks quite suspicious when you have all of these women known to have been associated with this condemned and now executed criminal who are rushing at top speed through the middle of this very overpopulated at this point in time, full city at the most important liturgical time of Israel's festival year, at the beginning of the workday, after the conclusion of the Sabbath, which, by the way, was an extra important Sabbath because of its closeness to Passover. So it is not really a strange or unusual. It is not anything that is ambiguous as to what Mark means when he says they said nothing to anyone. What were they afraid of? Well, in part, I think they were afraid that they were going to get nabbed by someone. I mean, this is suspicious behavior. I mean, this is, and they're running through the middle of the city. So what does it mean? It means they didn't say anything to anyone as they were running back to tell the disciples. I mean, that's the whole point, right? What are they running to do? Why are they running? They didn't intend to tell anyone, just like Why not just walk off quietly? Obviously, they meant to tell people because we're reading this right now. Okay, that would be obvious by the very fact that we're reading. Even if we didn't have any other Gospels and we say Mark ended with verse 8 and it was the first Gospel written and they didn't have an idea of a canon, everyone would have known that they told people because we're reading the story. So how did we get the story? I mean, obviously these women are not the authors of the Gospel collectively. This is not their coming out story. It's just, I, spend a little time on this, but it's such a it's an argument you hear all the time. How can Mark be correct in saying they said nothing to anyone, and then the other Gospels say they told the disciples? Well, it's one of those things which is just, yeah, you know what I'm saying. All love to you folks who made this argument, but it's time to put this one to bed, ladies and gentlemen. My argument with respect to the actual narrative structure of the text goes back to Genesis 29. We know that Mark is making reference to Genesis 29, not only verbally with reference to the large stone, but the connection that has been made, that is the tomb of Jesus and the well of Jacob, turns out to be very, very productive in terms of looking at what follows out from the correspondence between these two objects. When we actually look at the narrative structure of Genesis 29, we see something quite interesting. We see that there is a roughly similar kind of narrative structure in that we have a description of something which happened within a relatively short period of time, something that happened within a single day. This is Genesis 29. Verse 1, Jacob went on his journey, came to the people of the land of the east. Then he saw the well in the field, and then so on. Describes the conversation he had. This is his first meeting with Rachel, who is his bride-to-be. He meets her at a well, as we've discussed. And then he has this meeting with Laban, and that goes all the way to a verse... I think it's about verse 15. Now, from this point onwards, specifically from after verse 19. So from verse 20 onwards, before this point, not 1 to 19, we've got things which have happened in a period of hours, okay, like Mark 16, 1 to 8. Now, after this, we have a description of things that take place over a decade of time. The narrative is now massively telescoped relative to what was going on in the first 19 verses. So when we recognize that Mark has begun his narrative of the resurrection with a reference to Genesis 29, and he intends for us to see this reference, this intertextuality, there's a reason that it is quote-unquote hidden. But, as Jesus says in another context, a thing is only hidden so that it might be revealed. Intertexts are designed to be found with study so that when one recognizes them, they will be seen as part of the larger reality which is acquired through study of the text in question. It's the glory of God to conceal a thing, the glory of kings to search it out. So we have the first part of this is within a few hours. Second part, we've got years now, have been described in the period of several verses. So in Mark, we've 16, 1 to 8 takes place in one morning. Well, then 16, 9 to 20, it not only describes everything that happened from the time of Easter Sunday to Jesus' ascension into heaven. And notice the quotation of Psalm 110. When he sat down at the right hand of God, it's a quotation of Psalm 110. But it includes a narration, essentially, of the book of Acts. We don't think of it that way because it is so telescoped that it's just the apostles' ministry. But in terms of the chronological span, Mark 16, 20, well, that's the entire apostolic age. Mark 16, 19, then Lord Jesus, after he's spoken to them, was taken up into heaven. He sat down at the right hand of God, and they went out and preached everywhere. So the Lord has gone before them. Now he's gone into heaven. He's been exalted to the right hand of God as high priest, as the one who mediates the divine presence to his people. That's what actually the language of going before is all about. And now The apostles mirror him in the other direction. Jesus having gone before them, having led them to the mountain, the apostles then go out from the mountain and bring people back to it. They went out, preached everywhere, the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs. The reference to signs here, arguably, I would need to double check this and pursue this a little bit, but arguably refers to Isaiah 66, which in turn refers to Numbers 14, which would roll together with the new Exodus theme, which is a major part of Mark's Gospel. But the major point here in relation to the text that we've been looking at is that here in Mark 16, we have the first half is one day, a few hours even. The second half is years and years collapsed into a very short time span. So, arguably, the relationship between Genesis 29 and Mark 16 allows one to have a deeper look at why Mark has written the text that he has written, and why jumping to textual corruption is jumping the gun. Why we will miss things that Mark wanted us to see in his gospel if we default to the explanation of textual corruption, as is true when we do source critical stuff in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so thank you for following through. This may be the end of a second video. I don't know exactly how I'm going to put this together because this is quite lengthy, but I really hope you enjoyed going through this text with me, going through the nature of biblical theology with me, and I look forward to engaging with you more.